Mom, Dad, there's no way that I can express to you what I'm feeling right now. My heart is full to bursting, except to say, I'm the king of the world!
Hello and welcome back to Cameron, King of the World. And in this video we're going to be talking about James Cameron's Spider-Man. Yeah, you might not be aware of this. You might be, for all I know. I certainly had never... I'd heard inklings of it here and there throughout my kind of teenage movie-loving life, but I never really did a deep look. And I still haven't. I haven't, like, dug the script out and read the whole thing from front to back, but I've done some research, and it surprised me how far along this project actually came before Cameron didn't make a Spider-Man movie. And the Spider-Man movie that came out in 2002 actually quite closely resembles what he originally wrote in the 90s. So I figured it was worth mentioning and talking about in a standalone video in this mammoth series at this point. It almost feels like I'm leaving no stone unturned, but there are many things I could talk about with like unrealized James Cameron projects, but Spider-Man to me feels like the meatiest, like the one that I could really sink my teeth into, discuss, and especially considering the kind of film that it is, the kind of film he never really made, and what the kind of the superhero landscape would look like now in films if James Cameron's Spider-Man had been made in the 90s, because you know, it's a really interesting genre, the superhero film, if you look at it from its kind of inception. And I suppose you can look back to the early days of the movie serials in the 1940s, where we had Batman and other things going on, and then the early, like, Fleischer Superman cartoons, and that kind of began to morph and kind of mold into television stuff. We had Batman in the 60s. But really the first big motion picture, you know, Superman, the motion picture in the 70s was like... that was the big one, and then they made the second one, and so, you know, Christopher Reeve's Superman series really is like, as far as I'm aware, I mean, obviously they made the Batman 66 movie, you know, in the 60s, and so there had been movies about superheroes and comic book characters, but the first big kind of success, I think, as far as something that then spawned sequels, which now is the model that is very much in place today, was the Superman series. But it didn't seem to spark off this whole run of big comic book movies. And maybe studios tried, and certain kind of, you know, comic book movies were made, and Howard the Duck was made, you know, little things like that. But, you know, it wasn't then again until Batman rolled along in 1989 that it was like, okay, now we're going to bring this back after 10 years, and we're gonna go all in on a big superhero franchise in the cinema. And so Tim Burton's Batman spawned a 4-movie cycle that kind of dominated, you know, a lot of the kind of big budget blockbusters of that time in the late 80s and early 90s, because Batman in 1989 was a huge success. I mean, it was massive. The marketing and the kind of the production and the merchandising, all of that stuff, it became a phenomenon more than just a movie, and that kind of set the template a little bit. And then I think really truly what we live in now in terms of the superhero bubble in big movies really started with, I think, the X-Men movie in 2000, and then Spider-Man just kind of kicked that door completely off its hinges, and we never really looked back. And after, you know, the first Spider-Man came out in 2002, within a few years, someone had figured out a way to really tap into something. And in 2008, the Marvel Cinematic Universe began, and that is now one of the most successful franchises in film history. And that's kind of an era we're living in right now, where it's all these big Marvel movies coming from Marvel Studios, but it didn't just start like that. There had to be, you know, kind of almost testers into, could this work as a kind of multi-film spanning franchise that would be satisfying to audiences as stories spun from comic book tales, but also financially successful enough to bring people back into the cinemas again and again for multiple viewings, of course, of the same film, but also multiple movies in a set franchise. And interestingly enough, in 1989, so this would be after Cameron made The Abyss. When did The Abyss come out? Was it 1988 or 1989? Around the time of The Abyss. James Cameron was married to Catherine Bigelow, and she was looking to direct a Marvel movie in the late 80s, and it was going to be Wolverine and the X-Men. And Cameron actually came on board to this project as a producer. And at that time, he spoke to Stan Lee, and Stan Lee actually was talking to Cameron about a big screen adaptation of Spider-Man. And this really got Cameron's gears moving, because when he was a kid, when he was in high school, he was thinking about what, a really good Spider-Man movie could look like. And he said, on record that for him, when he was growing up, Spider-Man was his guy. He loved the Marvel stuff. He wasn't really interested in Batman or Superman, though he did also clarify that he loved the Nolan trilogy. But he was always more of a Marvel-focused fan when it came to the Marvel comics. Any comics. Marvel was the kind of brand that he loved, and Spider-Man was probably his favorite character, I'm assuming, because that was what really kind of piqued his interest when Stan Lee brought it up to him. So he decided, okay, I'm going to write what I think a good Spider-Man movie would be. And so he went and he wrote a treatment for a script for a Spider-Man movie. Then he was doing Terminator 2, and at that point, with the special effects and especially the T-1000 character and pushing the boundary of digital technology, I can't help but wonder and speculate if it wasn't that made Cameron think, maybe we could do something really cool with Spider-Man on the big screen in a live-action movie, because there'd been the Spider-Man cartoon, and there had been the Japanese Spider-Man film. I think it's a film or a series, and they'd done some TV movies, but it was kind of hokey stuff. And I'm sure that Cameron didn't want to make a hokey movie. He wanted to make something that was a bit more adult, a bit more with it, I suppose, but also ultimately about a coming-of-age story for a teenage boy in Peter Parker. And so he went and he wrote this Spider-Man script, made Terminator 2, and was kind of, I guess, maybe weighing up his options a little bit and thinking, well, maybe I'll do something with that at some point and just kind of let it sit in a drawer somewhere, I'm assuming. And then after he had done True Lies, kind of momentum started picking up again around this project. So it's interesting for me to decide where to kind of place this video in the Cameron King of the World series, because there's multiple points in which it kind of started and then stopped. But I think really after True Lies was perhaps the moment in which it almost could have happened, because Cameron submitted this script, which he'd really written, in 1991, because Carol Co. Pictures, who had worked with Cameron on Terminator 2, they had the rights to Spider-Man on the big screen. And it's a long history that I'm not going to get into, because A, you're probably not interested, and B, I'd have to remember all those fucking studios, because there's so many different fingers in the pie when it came to the kind of motion picture rights for Spider-Man at the time. But Carol Co. at that point in time did have the rights to do a Spider-Man movie. So Cameron's like, well, I'll just team up with them and we'll try and get the ball rolling. Stan Lee read the script. He loved it. He thought that it was exactly to him what the character of Spider-Man was. But he thought that it also added something new to proceedings and stuff. So Stan Lee was really happy with it. The script seemed to be a success. Now, the casting for James Cameron's Spider-Man, that's interesting, because I've read who was kind of in the running, but I don't think anything official. I mean, it really, the film never got to a point. I mean, there's storyboards online, there was a scriptment, but I'm not sure exactly how far casting really got off the ground. Maybe people were approached, but I don't think that anything actually binding was set. Although, interestingly enough, going back to 1989 with Catherine Bigelow's X-Men movie, which would then eventually be made in 2000, well, I'm sure with many changes along the way, but Bob Hoskins was originally, I think, actually attached to play Wolverine in the X-Men movie. That would have been an interesting alternate universe right there, but instead he went and made Super Mario Brothers the movie. Yeah. Anyway, so on with Cameron's Spider-Man. The casting. There's rumors, and it stands to reason that Edward Furlong was in mind for Peter Parker. I mean, around that time, after Terminator 2, it had been a successful collaboration between him and Cameron. I guess a few years after Terminator 2, he'd be kind of the perfect age for Peter Parker, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, you look at the kind of grittier stuff that Edward Furlong went on to do after Terminator 2, especially American History X, and you wonder whether he would have really fit the role of Peter Parker, but I think, at that point in time, it's possible. Leonardo DiCaprio was also considered. Obviously, this is before he worked with Cameron on Titanic, and DiCaprio's career was really starting to pick up momentum around that time. I think with Gilbert Grape, Basketball Diaries, he was doing, moving on from stuff like, what was it, Critters 4 he was in or something like that. So DiCaprio was picking up some momentum, and his name might have been thrown around there. Then when it came to villains, this is really interesting, actually. When it came to villains, at the very least, Cameron had 3 characters in mind: Electro, Sandman, and Dr. Octopus. And apparently he had in mind, I don't know if they were contacted or talked about, if anything was discussed officially, but apparently for Electro, Lance Henriksen was in consideration. For Sandman, Michael Biehn was in consideration. And for Dr. Octopus, Arnold Schwarzenegger, which makes a lot of sense because he's worked with them before, but I don't know if this might just be, again, speculation based on, actors who he continued to work with again and again. I don't know. But it certainly would have been wild from the perspective of being now in 2021 and seeing everything they've done with, what would it be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Spider-Man movies since then. In various rebooted forms, of course, but having seen variants of all those characters now, and knowing those actors like Michael Biehn, Lance Henriksen, Arnold Schwarzenegger, you think, how would they have made those roles their own? Electro, I think with Electro and Sandman, they both had kind of a similar backstory in that there was some experiment that went wrong, and so they have these abilities. And with Electro, he could manipulate data and could kind of get money very easily, but he couldn't touch people. And he had a wife, and I guess they tried to make love, and he almost killed her. And so it's kind of that's kind of a nice, I honestly can't remember for the life of me what the backstory and intent and motivation and arc there is in the character of Electro in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, because those Andrew Garfield movies to me just weren't very memorable, So I can't remember if that was similarly done. But either way, I like the kind of where Cameron was going with Electro. And Sandman, I didn't read as much about that characterization, but you can't help but think and draw comparisons between what they could have done with Sandman with digital effects and what they did with the T-1000 in Terminator 2 with kind of the body morphing and stuff like that. And I think that the version we got of Sandman in Spider-Man 3 in 2007 was visually incredible. And I'm kind of glad that it didn't happen in the mid-90s, because I just don't think it would have been... It wouldn't be up to snuff. I've talked about this before, where the T-1000 was so successful because it's a very easy texture. It's just kind of a reflective chrome surface. And I think that when you get into like sand and particles in the mid-90s, I just don't think it would have held up today. It wouldn't have aged well, But either way, and also I also think that there's maybe too many villains at play there, and so maybe you're kind of trying to force too many into one film, which is ultimately the reason people don't like Spider-Man 3. I really like Spider-Man 3, but I do think there's too many antagonists in that film to really fully grab on. There's like 4, really, when you think about it. Wait, is it 4, or am I thinking of another film? No, because of course there's Venom and kind of Eddie Brock, and then we have Sandman, and then I guess technically it would be James Franco's character, whose name has completely escaped me. Harry Osborn, who kind of takes on the Green Goblin mantle. But was there another one? I can't remember if there was another one. But yeah, so there's 3. There's like Sandman, Green Goblin, and I've already forgotten. What's the other? Venom. Okay, yes, it was those 3 kind of. Anyway, getting way off track. I think that maybe Cameron bit off more than he can chew with the amount of villains, but also maybe it would have worked. I mean, you do have comic book stories that have multiple villains, and it is possible to make it work within a single film, I think. But, this is all speculation. We don't know that for sure, but you have to kind of imagine that Cameron knew a little bit about what he was doing and kind of had an idea of how to make those villains work. The film was going to open with a kind of shots on Spider-Man's face and kind of the webbing and zooming out very slowly, and he's hanging upside down from the World Trade Center, and then he just swings through the city, and you hear the narration, very comic book kind of style, and then we'd get the kind of backstory. And it plays out fairly similarly to what we saw in 2002 with Sam Raimi's version, and from what I understand, when everything went to shit with James Cameron's version, when Columbia Pictures and Sony were finally going to get the rights together to make this film, and Sam Raimi came on board as director, they used Cameron's stuff as the basis for what they did moving forward. And you can see that. You can see the comparisons for sure in a lot of what Cameron wrote in his original script and what eventually made it into the Sam Raimi version. And so, You do get a lot of similar story beats, you know, him getting bitten by the spider and stuff. But there's these little twists and additional details that Cameron included that certainly fit into a more R-rated version of the story and film, in which Peter Parker kind of gets bitten by the spider, and then I think he wakes up on a building somewhere. And then one morning he wakes up and there's a very, very obvious wet dream joke in which he pulls open the quilt and there's like all this webbage stuck underneath in the quilt, in the kind of the sheets in the quilt. And he has these organic web shooters, which is, I think, a Cameron invention. Like his reasoning was that he didn't think it was permissible, probably, that a teenager could invent like web shooter devices, which is, I believe, what the original Spider-Man character had, was just the devices. So in Cameron's script, it was organic web shooting stuff, because he didn't think that Peter Parker would be smart enough to invent something like that so easily, or have the resources to invent something like that so easily. But he did have Peter wear fake web shooters so that people wouldn't look at him as a freak, because what he does in Cameron's version is he actually becomes a bit of a celebrity. He goes out and kind of performs in the streets, and he gets onto a variety TV show, becomes a little bit famous. And, you know, they kind of do a little bit of that in Raimi's version, where he goes into this wrestling competition. And in the Cameron version, he goes to like a bookie's office, I guess, to get the money from, or booking agent, not bookies, a booking agent's office. He's not going to bet on anything, although I guess, you know, he probably could make some money trying to bet on things that Spider-Man might do next. But going as Peter Parker, I have a bet that Spider-Man's going to show up at this point in time in New York City, and you get your photographers down there and then pay me some money if I'm right. No, not a bookie's office, a booking agent's office. And he was supposed to be paid some money for his TV appearance as Spider-Man. But you know, they didn't pay him for whatever reason. And then someone stole money from them and he let them go. And this leads to the death of Uncle Ben. But I think there's a harder kind of emphasis on the morality struggle with Peter Parker's powers in Cameron's version, where he sees Flash, Mary Jane's boyfriend, kind of being a bit rough with her, and I think he maybe hits her or something. And Peter, I don't know if I forget if he's in the suit or not, he beats the fuck out of this guy. And it says in the script that, you know, I don't know if he says this out loud, but like it felt good. Like he enjoyed inflicting pain, and he was kind of struggling with that a little bit, but like he was getting off on the thrill of being in that kind of powerful position and being able to beat up a bully, you know. And so that's kind of an interesting, you know, they don't really go as deep or hard on that kind of psychological element of Peter Parker in Sam Raimi's version, and I think for the better. I think that, but again, they're different characters. I think that Sam Raimi's version, and I don't know where that comes from exactly, where the writing difference comes from. I think it's David Koepp who wrote the screenplay for the Sam Raimi version, and there were a number of writers who I think's names got taken off, and it was solely credited with David Koepp, but he kind of worked with a lot of stuff that was already existing. But I like Tobey Maguire's kind of more sensitive. You know, I mean, and there's definitely an element of him feeling that surge of power and confidence at times, but not to the point of beating someone up and kind of enjoying it and kind of getting off on it. But it's an interesting way to take it, and it's a darker turn for the character, I think. And there's a few other things that get a little bit more racy in Cameron's Spider-Man. For one thing, he has Peter Parker kind of spying on Mary Jane while she's changing. And, you know, he's kind of basically a peeping Tom. And there's a little bit of that in the Raimi version. You see him kind of looking at her through the bedroom window, but it's fairly innocent and tame. But then there's the upside down kiss, which was not in Cameron's version, but there was a similar scene. And that upside down kiss, I mean, that's a fairly, you know, they they poured all this water on Kirsten Dunst and left nothing to the imagination of the audience. But, you know, the upside down kiss is very it's very racy and steamy for you know, for what it is. It's kind of a very hot moment, but Cameron's version takes it a few more steps further than that, where Spider-Man swoops up Mary Jane, takes her to the Brooklyn Bridge, proceeds to web her down so that she is like basically just bonded to the bridge. He does a little like he does a little dance, like a spider kind of mating ritual, and yeah, basically kind of ties her up and has sex with her. And you know, I read some of the dialogue, and it's like this one line where he says the female usually signals her willingness, you know, for this. Like the female usually signals her willingness for this mating ritual by an uncharacteristic passivity. which sounds very rapey to me. It's like, okay, I'm going to tie you down, and usually the way this goes is you're meant to just let me do it and lie there. Like, it's fucking weird. Like, I kind of get he's trying to, like, bring in the spider world stuff and, you know, make him act like a spider, but like an arachnid, but I think applying the mating rituals of spiders to humans is a very strange thing to go about. You know, injecting into a, you know, teen romance in a movie where he kind of I mean, I guess the idea is that she is consensual towards it. But you know, he's like webbing her down, and he says something to the effect of, you know, you're free to break out at any time. It's just a symbol, yeah, of the ritual. You know, it just it just seems like a guy making excuses for the fact that he's kind of forcing himself on someone. It's like they kiss and he pulls her skirt up, and I think the line in the script is like, they make love and she doesn't look. Like, what? Like, it's very weird, but that line where he's just like, you know, no, the women's supposed to just act passive in this kind of situation. This is fucking weird. I don't know. Anyway, and there's even stuff where he's swearing to the point of the big showdown at the end on top of the World Trade Center with Electro and Sandman, and Peter's like, I'll kill you, motherfucker. Like, I don't know, but you know, it's weird for me to look at that and say that doesn't fit, because I have in my head this version here, and I'm comparing it against that, when really that's not the most fair thing in the world, when it was Cameron's kind of his take on the character. And you know, Stan Lee, the creator of Spider-Man to begin with, loved the script and the story. And there's nothing wrong with taking things in a more adult direction, but that whole Brooklyn Bridge scene was very weird to read about. But there are other things where I think that Cameron would have really excelled. When, you know, Peter first gets bitten by the spider, and he's all out of it when he gets home, and there's a line in the script that describes the sequence in which, you know, we see him not being transformed, but the transformation beginning inside his blood, I suppose. And he wrote something in the script in the kind of the screen direction, is that what you call it in the script, where you're just kind of describing what it's going to look like on screen. There's another word for not screen direction, but maybe that's it, I don't know. But he's describing what you would see, and he says something like a David Lynch bio-horror montage of Spider-World. So like, he really wanted to get weird and interesting with some of the visuals in the film. And so, you know, you read a lot of the things that Cameron was going to do, and it's like, that could be a pretty good film. And he has kind of this showdown at the end, like I said, on the World Trade Center, and reveals himself just before one of the villains dies, and then he also speaks to MJ at the end of the film and pulls off the mask, reveals that it's him, and they kiss. And you know, so it's a pretty good start, I think. But it's hard when you have all these other films to compare it to. And I think looking at all of the Spider-Man movies, and I should say 8 movies, because Into the Spider-Verse exists as well, but as far as theatrical films go, obviously it's animated, and they've probably done many animated Spider-Man films, but, you know, as far as a big theatrical release, there's been 8. So I love the first one. I think the second one is incredible, and I think the character of Doc Ock in the second one is one of the best on-screen comic book movie villains. I think that he's just incredible. Alfred Molina's great. So, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger in that role, I don't know, but then maybe, who knows? You know, you think of these things, and you're not entirely sure how it would add up, how it would measure up. But the whole point is, I guess, if Cameron's version did happen, this one wouldn't have happened, and there would be nothing to measure it against anyway in the first place. So it kind of doesn't make much difference either way, I don't think. But yeah, but I liked the kind of the interesting morality stuff in it, where, you know, he was enjoying getting to be the bully almost. And I think that at one point he stops some crime going on. He almost considers keeping the money. Like, he's just, you know, he's not sure how to deal with this, which I think is exactly how a teenager would react. But in Raimi's version, you know, Peter's such a inherently good person that they don't take it that far. And I think that fits that version of the character. I mean, they play around with it where he does let the thief go, and that ultimately costs him his uncle's life, you know, in an indirect way. And so he learns the cost of his actions, and with great power comes great responsibility and everything. But yeah, so the reason the film didn't happen is, you know, all this to say, you know, Cameron had written it down, and they were kind of raring to go to make this thing, but it was eventually just a rights issue. It was really just, and I could, you know, even if I wrote everything down, it would be hard to get through, because there were so many different companies who all had a little bit of stake in this, and someone took the TV rights here, and someone took the big screen rights here, and it just kind of all fell apart. and Carolco Pictures went bankrupt, and so the project just kind of disintegrated in front of everyone's eyes like Sandman. You know, it just all filtered through the fingers and it was gone. And oh well, move on to the next thing. And Cameron very comfortably settled in 1995 to, I guess, abandoning the Spider-Man project, going out to the Atlantic Ocean, diving down to the shipwreck of Titanic, and beginning his journey towards making what would be, in a couple of years' time from that point, the most successful film of all time. So you can argue that Cameron's career took a better direction without him doing Spider-Man, but you can't help but wonder if he had made Spider-Man, would that have molded the future of superhero movies just a little bit? And I think ultimately perhaps not, because, you know, what we did get with Raimi's version is fairly in line with what Cameron was kind of toying with. Obviously there are differences and things got extended, like him kind of revealing himself to MJ didn't happen until the second movie. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I've seen the first trilogy actually of the Spider-Man films. And you know, these echoes come down through the Andrew Garfield movies and the now Tom Holland movies. So there's quite a big on-screen, big screen legacy for Spider-Man, and ultimately Cameron's version could have been the first kind of big one, but it ultimately was not to be. So yeah, it's just one of those things. But I thought it was interesting, and you know, just trying to imagine now what that film would have looked like, both, well, not even both, but under the direction of Cameron, with some of those actors in those roles, and with the CGI and digital technology that was available at that time. Like how, I don't know, how successful would it have been, you know? I mean, it could have changed the course of Cameron's career. You know, it could have been a failure, in which case maybe Titanic wouldn't have happened, in which case maybe Avatar wouldn't have happened, and then what would have Cameron done after that? Would he have focused on smaller movies? Maybe he would have made 10 more smaller movies than just 2 massive ones after True Lies. I mean, it's, again, all speculation. But that was James Cameron's Spider-Man, and just a little bit of an insight into what could have happened and what could have been. And yeah, it is what it is. But I was quite intrigued to kind of look into it, and I was both shocked at times, as I have already mentioned, with some of the things, like some of the language and the sexual elements. But you know, it's, I don't know, it would have been cool to see it, I think. And then you just have to wonder. Obviously, Cameron is completely tied up at the moment with, you know, potentially 4 Avatar sequels, 2 for definite. You know, I don't see him ever, if he manages to get all of those 4 sequels out and done, I don't see him ever directing a film after that. He'll be an old man at that point, and he's getting on in years now as it is. And he's certainly not going to start directing anything now, so, you know, there's absolutely no chance in the world that Cameron would take on a Marvel movie. But, you know, you can't help but think that if Cameron were to roll up at Kevin Feige's office and turn up to Marvel Studios and just put his hand down on the table and say, I want to direct a Marvel movie, I think they would pretty much bite his hand off, you know, because it's James fucking Cameron. So he could do it if he wanted to, but, you know, ultimately I think he moved on to pretend, well, definitely bigger and maybe not better things, but certainly bigger things. It depends on your point of view and which kind of movie you prefer, but certainly onto bigger things with Titanic and Avatar. But we'll talk about those in future videos. But I had to, yeah, just if there was one kind of doomed project that I wanted to talk about, it would be James Cameron's Spider-Man. So now I've talked about it, and we can kind of move on with the rest of the series. But the other one, which was almost a doomed Cameron project for many years, which we will touch on later on in the series, was Alita: Battle Angel. And that one actually did end up coming to fruition, but not through the directing lens of James Cameron, but he was still heavily involved in it. Whereas with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, he wasn't really involved. They were just taking what he had written and kind of adapting that into their own thing. So, yeah, I think that the 2 big ones, until Alita came out, would be his Spider-Man and his adaptation of Battle Angel Alita. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.